Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. Thank you for joining us. This afternoon, we'll focus on a new book by University of Sheffield historian Sarah Miller-Davenport, Gateway, State, Hawaii, and the Cultural Transformation of American Empire. Sarah, congratulations and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us Professor Daniel Immerwahr, who will provide initial comments and begin this afternoon's discussion that we will hope will involve many of you in the audience as well towards the end of the session. A warm welcome back to you, Daniel, as well. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the good fortune to be co-chairing this seminar series with my colleague Eric Arneson of George Washington University. Eric also serves as director of the National History Center. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For more than a decade now, the seminar series has provided a nonpartisan forum in the nation's capital to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications that shed new light on policy relevant issues in national and global affairs. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center, but we're now very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook, and we're delighted that many more people have been able to participate in these sessions. Behind the scenes, two individuals helped produce this event, Peter Bierstecker of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. Even in this Zoom era, staging these events is labor intensive, and we therefore ask for your financial support. We thank those of you who already have given us such support, and we also thank our two institutional sponsors, the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and the George Washington University History Department. Details on how to support the seminar are available right now in the chat room, in the chat function, or simply go to our institutional websites. A quick heads up that today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the seminar with the audience, we ask that you please use the raised hand function in the Zoom room if you would like to ask a question. Once you press the button, you will be entered into the queue. When the moderator, Eric, calls on you, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press the yes button, or you will not be able to talk. You can start getting in line even before the discussion period. You may also submit questions to Rachel Wheatley via email at rwheatley@historians.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Zoom room is yours, Eric.
Thank you, Christian. I am delighted to introduce our author this afternoon. Sarah Miller-Davenport is senior lecturer in U.S. history at the University of Sheffield, where she has been based since receiving her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2014. Her work has appeared in the Journal of American History, Diplomatic History, and History Workshop Journal, and her JAH article on U.S. evangelical missionaries after World War II won the Bernath Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Her first book received honorable mention for the British Association of American Studies Book Prize. This afternoon, she will be speaking on that book, Gateway, State, Hawaii, and the Cultural Transformation of American Empire, published by Princeton University Press. Sarah, and now the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you to Christian as well, and to Rachel and to Peter for doing the organizing of this event, and to the Washington History Seminar for hosting me. I'm actually not in Sheffield at the moment. I'm in Brooklyn because I'm doing research on my next project here. I should warn you, I give this warning before any kind of talk, that I have my dog here with me, and she occasionally likes to communicate with the dog next door. So I apologize in advance if that happens. I don't know about you all, I could not feel farther away from Hawaii right now as I sit in my apartment in Brooklyn with a blizzard raging outside, but I'll do my best to conjure Hawaii at mid-century for us this afternoon. And Know just say that this is a very kind of whistle-stop tour through my book, you know, and so I know Daniel has questions about the rest of the book, but hopefully you'll get a sense of the broad outlines and argument that I am making. I'll start us off in the summer of 1960, when John F. Kennedy declared that rather than opening his campaign in Detroit on Labor Day, which had been a Democratic Party tradition since the New Deal, his bid for office would officially launch in Honolulu, followed by a stop in Alaska. To Kennedy, Hawaii was a powerful example of the new frontier, the vague but evocative theme of his campaign, and eventually his presidency. Suggesting to Americans that global developments demanded a new kind of labor, Kennedy extolled the spirit of adventure that had led their 19th century forebears to seek novel experiences in Hawaii. Hawaii, Kennedy claimed, was not only a product of past expansionist sentiment, but must also be a site for its rechristening and for the work of securing America's political and ideological influence abroad. As the nation's first state with a majority Asian population, Hawaii held great symbolic value to America's expansionist global mission. Quote, "It represents the outstanding example in the world today of peoples of many races and national origins living and working together in peace and harmony," Kennedy said. Quote, "It represents as well a bridge to Asia." Now, Kennedy did not, in fact, launch his campaign in Hawaii, choosing instead to open in Alaska and send to Honolulu in his place vice presidential candidate Lyndon Johnson, who had gone to great lengths to secure Hawaii's statehood in the Senate. To Kennedy, Hawaii was as much an idea as a place. He did not have to experience its magic to invoke it. Of course, Hawaii was a place, one whose culturally mixed society and geographic proximity to Asia had given form to the visions that surrounded it. Those characteristics would be deployed in the service of various policy and money-making projects that brought unprecedented numbers of people to the islands in the decades following Hawaii's admission as a state in 1959. Only a small fraction of Americans would come to know the islands firsthand, however. Like Kennedy's use of Hawaii to suggest broader themes about America's role in the world, Hawaii's resonance in American politics and culture far exceeded its size. Gateway State explores how and why Hawaii was invested with such significance at the height of American Cold War hegemony. It marks the passage of Hawaii from territory to state, a process that also transformed Hawaii from a suspect alien land into an imagined racial and consumer paradise and conduit for US-Pacific relations. The core producers of this new vision of Hawaii were centered in both Honolulu and the mainland US, drawn from the ranks of Hawaii's democratic leadership, Pacific-oriented members of Congress, modernization advocates in higher education and the federal government, popular liberal writers, and Hawaii's business community, notably those in tourism. They helped institutionalize Hawaii as a space where the US met Asia and where Americans could encounter Asians in fruitful and lucrative exchange. The liberal multicultural vision they developed was then embraced, reformulated, and contested by ordinary Americans, both the continental US and in Hawaii. Unlike all 49 states that came before it, Hawaii's full inclusion in the nation was based less on claims that not that emphasized Hawaii's sameness to the rest of the US, but rather its fundamental difference. Hawaii had met the constitutional criteria for statehood well before World War II, and its political and educational institutions followed mainland practice. But its mixed and majority ethnically Asian population was a perpetual obstacle to statehood, even up until the late 1950s. By 1959, however, Hawaii was valuable to the US precisely because it was home to so many people of Asian descent. So why did post-war Americans, from tourists to Peace Corps officials to members of Congress, decide to embrace Hawaii, both the place and the idea, so enthusiastically after rejecting its people for so long? And the answer lies in the intersection of global decolonization and the delegitimation of legalized racism in US politics and culture. These were related developments, as other scholars have shown. Gateway State, however, brings post-war racial formation in the US and global decolonization into the same frame, not just analytically, but materially, as Hawaii's change in legal status was based on a reimagining of race, culture, and foreignness. Hawaii's statehood, in marked contrast to the parallel issue of Alaska statehood, transcended its more prosaic implications to become part of a larger national reckoning over the meaning of American democracy in the era of civil rights and decolonization. Once a racially problematic overseas territory whose population was deemed unassimilable, Hawaii by the 1960s was being touted as a global exemplar of racial harmony and an emblem of the new frontier. And Kennedy's new frontier was a concept that signaled a more expansive understanding of American national identity, both in terms of who could be counted as American at home and what areas of the world were considered to be within the US sphere of influence. Global decolonization and Hawaii statehood complemented US efforts to promote the nation state as the primary building block of the post-war global order. Against this background, Hawaii, as an overseas colony legally distinct from the rest of the US, appeared to many as an aberration needing resolution. But American support for the nation state and Hawaii's statehood along with it were also a response to the demands of the peoples of the decolonizing world, who put pressure on the United States to voice its support for decolonization. So grassroots revolutionary forces abroad had transformative effects on the US state and society in the post-war period, and statehood is one example of that. So the US may have sought to control the process of decolonization, but it did not originate it. As a non-self-governing territory with a mostly Asian population, many of whose members were only became eligible for citizenship in 1952 when Congress overturned anti-Asian naturalization laws, Hawaii was a real problem for the US, belying its anti-colonialist, anti-racist rhetoric as it sought to win friends in the decolonizing world. Statehood, according to its supporters, would be a boon to US foreign relations, and a practically cost-free one at that. It would, with one piece of legislation, demonstrate to the decolonizing world that America practiced what it preached on the issue of self-government. And by making Hawaii a fully equal part of the nation, as opposed to casting it off, the US could counter Soviet claims of American racism and show the so-called third world that it valued non-Western culture. So Hawaii required self-government without severance, statehood, not independence. The transformation of Hawaii from colony to state was a fraught and incomplete process, which I'll touch on at the end of my talk today. To understand the significance of statehood to US politics and culture, and by extension, the domestic impact of global decolonization, it's necessary to examine how the meaning of statehood was debated and constructed. So from the start of the post-war campaign for Hawaii statehood, the issue highlighted many of the most vital global and domestic challenges facing post-war US society. It also demonstrated their interconnectedness. Until 1952, when Congress overturned racial bars to immigration and naturalization, much of Hawaii's Asian-born population was disenfranchised. Meanwhile, Hawaii was a recognized colony of America's overseas empire, designated by the UN as a non-self-governing territory, along with those colonies of the major European powers. And the racial difference of Hawaii's people was at the center of its continued colonial limbo. Earlier bids for statehood in the 1930s had failed after Congress deemed the island's majority Asian population to be unassimilable. After the war, most of the opponents to statehood were Southern Democrats. Not only were they repulsed by Hawaii's mixed and multiracial population, but they believed a congressional delegation from Hawaii would provide the crucial votes necessary for civil rights reform. Early proponents of statehood in Hawaii attempted to address the problem of race by downplaying it. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, members of the Hawaii Statehood Commission, drawn mainly from Honolulu's white business and political elite, worked to frame Hawaii's bid in terms of its worthiness in meeting all the legal criteria for statehood, and to present Hawaii as an average American community, i.e. a white community. In one instance, the Statehood Commission went so far as to distort Hawaii's demographic makeup in a letter to a mainland newspaper by insisting that the territory was majority white, an assertion that was only true if one used population statistics that included military personnel temporarily stationed in Hawaii for the war. It was statehood advocates outside of Hawaii, increasingly concerned about how America's reputation for racial inequality might affect its expansionist aims in the Pacific, who helped change the narrative around Hawaii's claim to statehood. And this, of course, takes place in the context of the Korean War, as the United States increasingly comes to see Asia as key to its strategic interests. By the mid-1950s, the whiteness and even the Americanism of Hawaii were becoming less significant than the island's connection to Asia. The Statehood Commission's tactic of emphasizing Hawaii's sameness to the mainland had largely failed. They could never convince Southern Democrats that Hawaii was white. Hawaii's statehood, many supporters in Congress argued, could be a weapon in the Cold War in Asia, where people struggling for self-rule were buying the Soviet line that the US was a racist imperial power. Asians interpreted Hawaii's continued territorial status as a sign that not only was the US ambivalent on decolonization, which of course it was, but as a House subcommittee report argued that, quote, there are racial barriers in the American system of government that militate against people of Oriental origin, which of course was also true. By transforming Hawaii's status, statehood advocates argued the US would send a powerful message to Asia that we are not exponents of colonial imperialism, but stand for democracy and self-government. With DC lawmakers predicting that, quote, the next century may well be the Pacific century, Hawaii's role as a strategic US outpost in the Pacific was amplified, giving new weight to claims that the US might benefit from having a state oriented towards Asia. In this new capacity, Hawaii, according to Washington Senator Henry Jackson, would, quote, come into the Union not only as the 50th state, but as our diplomatic state next door to over half the population of the world. Just as DC policymakers were promoting the foreign policy uses of Hawaii's statehood, events on the ground in Hawaii were challenging the conservative approach of the Hawaii Statehood Commission and the old territorial politics it represented. In 1954, a coalition of labor organizers and Nisei veterans propelled the Democratic Party to power in the territorial legislature, upending the Republicans' 5-decade rule. Hawaii's new democratic leadership intensified their efforts to secure statehood. In 1956, Hawaii's Democratic Party chair, John Burns, was elected as the territory's congressional delegate. He also actively courted Southern Democrats in Congress, most importantly, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, who saw Hawaii as a model for US race relations. Although Johnson was initially opposed to statehood because he thought it might upset the partisan balance in the Senate, he ended up being instrumental in securing its passage. And Burns, as representative of a changing Hawaii, also helped to consolidate the pro-statehood argument. No longer would the emphasis be so heavily on Hawaii's Americanness. Besides sending a strategic message to the peoples of Asia around US support for self-government, Burns argued that Hawaii's statehood would enhance American power by drawing Hawaii's people and their ethnic knowledge of Asia closer to the US. Quote, the citizen of Hawaii, that new man of the Pacific, declared Burns, will be our most effective bridge to the Asian world. So you can see this theme of Hawaii as a bridge to Asia developing during the statehood debates. And after statehood, policymakers and business leaders worked together to institutionalize the idea of Hawaii as a bridge to Asia. They believed Hawaii offered an ideal setting for cultural exchange and what they called mutual understanding, that Hawaii was a place where foreigners could be trained in American economic and cultural practices, and where foreign ways could be demystified for Americans. By the end of 1960, on Johnson's initiative, Congress had established the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii, and 2 years later, the islands would become host to the largest domestic training center for the Peace Corps. Hawaii's difference from the rest of the US was pressed into the service of American foreign policy. Asian Americans in Hawaii never lost their perceived connection to Asia or became white, as had other immigrant groups. Instead, their Asianness was transformed into a marketable resource, one that could serve and that should serve national ends. For instance, for Americans, the various ethnic groups of Hawaii were expected to help turn them into, quote, intercultural workers. Through daily interactions with the Japanese and Filipino immigrant workers living near the training site, volunteers would hone their intercultural communication skills, thus preparing them for working with the communities they would encounter in Asia. Similarly to the administrators of Hawaii's new East-West Center, the 50th state exemplified, quote, the useful employment of diversities for mutual good, a concept that I argue represented an early iteration of what would later be called multiculturalism. Mutual good here referred to the spread of American-style modernization to the decolonizing world. Most accounts of multiculturalism in the US have attributed it to a grassroots effort by minoritized communities to assert their rights to cultural recognition in the wake of formal legal equality. But as the ideas circulating in and around Hawaii attest, the emergence of multiculturalist ideology among liberal elites and at the highest levels of policy was in large part a product of American global expansion. The conversations about Hawaii in the post-war era also reverberated beyond the foreign policy establishment. The Hawaii tourism industry, for instance, promoted the islands as home to, quote, a montage of minorities, a bounty of cultures. The tourism industry sought to entice continental Americans to Hawaii with an invitation to partake in the island's celebrated aloha spirit, an elusive vision of social harmony that could be achieved by attending ethnic festivals, eating exotic food, and interacting with locals. Americans also embraced Hawaii food and fashion in this period, which served as a way for them to experience Hawaii without actually leaving home. In these discourses, particularly in the late 1960s, this image of Hawaii as a multiracial paradise was often subtly contrasted to the racial uprisings taking place across US cities. The multiculturalism that developed in Hawaii was thus a limited one. It celebrated difference only if it advanced mutual good as defined by those in power. This was a vision of multiculturalism that was increasingly challenged as the glow of statehood waned. Advocates of ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii were often the most vocal opponents of the new status quo. They called for a radical multiculturalism that challenged the self-proclaimed progressivism of the state's many white-dominated institutions. Rather than treating racism as a matter of personal prejudice in a society that otherwise supported racial equality, the ethnic studies paradigm argued that racism was fundamental to American society by stressing the persistence of racial inequality in Hawaii and the legacy of colonial conquest. Ethnic studies advocates and a wider network of radical activists undermined state boosters' assertions that Hawaii was a racial paradise or model of American self-government. These conflicts highlighted the incompleteness of both Hawaii's decolonization and national civil rights reform. By contrast, the liberal multiculturalism of the tourism industry and foreign policy establishment offered a powerful narrative of national progress. Hawaii may no longer take up the same national, political, or cultural space that it did in mid-century America, but the history of statehood unearths the roots of racial liberalism as we know it today, however embattled it may sometimes seem. Hawaii's statehood, in representing an embrace of diversity over assimilation, urged Americans to shed their provincialisms in service of both national expansion and personal fulfillment. And yet in Hawaii, as in the rest of the US, the celebration of difference has all too often masked the structures of violence and inequality, both global and domestic, in which difference has been produced and sustained. The liberalism of Hawaii's statehood promised Americans redemption by transforming a history of racism and colonialism into the basis for a multicultural future and a source of American power. This is a narrative that continues to resonate precisely because of what it leaves out. And I'll end there and throw it to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Daniel Immerwahr is professor of history at Northwestern University. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, Thinking Small, the United States and the Lure of Community Development, published by Harvard University Press in 2015, and more recently, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States, published by Farrar Straus in 2019. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The Nation, Dissent, Jacobin, and Slate, among other places. And a very recent intervention, History Isn't Just for Patriots, appeared in the pages of the Washington Post in December. I should also mention that Daniel is an alum of the National History Center's International Seminar on Decolonization, as is Sarah. And with that, Daniel, Zoom room is yours.
Wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here to the degree that anyone can be here anymore. And I mean, both to be back at the seminar, but also to be talking about Sarah's wonderful book. And I should say that Sarah's research has been really important to mine. And I've been reading Sarah's stuff since she was producing chapters of the dissertation and reading it eagerly. And it informs my own sense and my own writings about the US territorial empire. So Sarah, I just want to start with a kind of a broad observation and get your reflections on it. It strikes me that a lot of the scholarship on US foreign relations used to be about policies. So, you know, this Cold War stance, that Cold War stance, that kind of thing. And I think we're seeing a lot more work that is about places and particular locales. And this is true not just of the book that you're talking about, Gateway State, but it's also true of the research you're doing now. And I'm wondering if you could just reflect on what you see as being behind that term, why that appealed to you, if that is indeed a kind of appropriate characterization of your work.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, one very obvious answer, right, is that, but, you know, it kind of limits the scope of your project in a way, in a way that's very helpful, right, when you're doing research, to say, I'm going to focus on this one place and see what it tells us about all of these larger developments. But I think, you know, thinking about this from a more kind of deliberate methodological perspective, you know, of course, all historians deploy place and space, whether they do that deliberately or not, right? Usually you do it within the context of the nation, right? That kind of national approach has come under fire from US and the world historians who say, well, we need to think in more global terms and not reinforce nationalism and exceptionalism. You know, you also have, now that I'm doing a kind of urban history, you have urban historians, of course, who have, you know, taken, you know, a very different tack and said, you know, by focusing on this hyper local space, you know, that allows us, you know, more, I don't know, thick description and you know, a more kind of, perhaps even a kind of accurate assessment of history that doesn't just collapse, you know, the entire nation, you know, into one narrative. I mean, I think they're all right. You know, I don't think these are necessarily, these different scales are in conflict with each other. You know, certainly for this project, I wanted to delocalize statehood because it seemed to me that, you know, what had been written on statehood was very much focused on the local politics of it and kind of the local effects of it. Whereas I really had a hunch at the beginning of this project and tried to argue in the book that actually what's going on in Hawaii and not just what's going on in Hawaii itself, but the kind of image of Hawaii and the construction of Hawaii and the way in which it's put to these particular foreign policy uses tells us a lot about, you know, the kind of the ways in which global developments kind of seep their way into domestic politics and culture. For my next project, I'm taking in some ways an opposite tack, which is telling like a hyper local story and showing how that has global effects, right? So my next project is on New York, the reinvention of New York as a global city after its 1975 fiscal crisis. And I really see the global city as a response to kind of hyper local conditions, right? Where New York is kind of cut off from federal funds, you know, it has these like very high tax obligations to the state, you know, there are all kinds of like, you know, super local things that has, you know, population flight, and that then kind of leads leaders within New York to turn to this effort to attract global capital to the city. And within that transformation, you actually see, all these kind of practices and ideas that develop within New York that then get exported abroad. So New York kind of becomes a model global city, which in many ways was not predictable in 1975 and is very much a kind of response to hyperlocal conditions. But yeah, it's sort of, both of these projects are kind of playing with scale and trying to bring these three different scales, kind of the local, national, and global, into some kind of fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I was struck by this term you just used, delocalize. I wanted to delocalize the history of Hawaii because I recognize you as doing that. The traditional way to write the history of a place, or at least familiar to us, having read a lot of social history, is that that's a way to really get into people's lives. And sort of the smaller the scale, the more fine-grained your appreciation can be of the texture of everyday life. And boy, that's not what your book does. And it's not to say that you aren't interested in locality, especially in that chapter on the University of Hawaii. You're really getting into sort of the daily political struggles. But the questions that arise are not questions that spring out of the soil of Hawaii. They're questions about where Hawaii fits in a larger symbolic global framework. And that strikes me as what I see a lot of people doing. I'm partly following you in US foreign relations, just looking for not spaces that are representative, but spaces that are somehow peripheral, or it might seem peripheral, but are nevertheless really important. And to look at them is to get the history of the whole, not because they reflect the whole, but because they somehow channel forces or processes that otherwise might be harder to see elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think, Hawaii's kind of peripherality, if that's a word, is really key to kind of how it's perceived and how it's used, right? It's specifically the fact that it's not kind of fully American, or not perceived as fully American, that allows it to be a bridge to Asia. And that, that really is kind of ultimately why, that is the reason given for, that's the justification given for statehood, right? Which I think is unique in the history of statehood in the United States. And then that has all kinds of kind of ripple effects domestically from there.
So let's back up a little bit chronologically to before Hawaii and just its statehood takes on this Cold War valence that you described so well. There's this kind of earlier possibility that Hawaii might have statehood, indeed before World War II in the 1940s. And as you point out, there's a lot of resistance to it. And I pulled this quotation, which I found evocative, but having gone through some of the same archival boxes, I've seen many other examples of this kind of thing. So this is a Maryland resident, David Atchison, in the 40s, explaining why Hawaii can't be a state. I presume this guy is white. To make a state of Hawaii would mean to give free access to the hordes of yellows, blacks, Filipinos, Koreans, Japanese, Puerto Ricans, etc. And boy, there is a lot of that kind of sentiment. And it's kind of, once you kind of see that arrayed, it becomes remarkable to see that Hawaii does become a state, to see that overcome. And so there's other aspects that I want to get into in a second, but could we first just talk about statehood as a kind of civil rights achievement, or where it fits in the sort of logic of civil rights, or where it fits in the narrative of civil rights? It doesn't usually come up as something that's part of the civil rights story as we tell it, but you read stuff like that and you start to see that maybe it could be. As far as I understand it, Hawaii is really the first state, Alaska is a maybe possibility, that where white control and in fact white population dominance wasn't the argument for why it should become a state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, I'll just say that the white population does have, does kind of allow for statehood, in the sense that, when Hawaii was annexed to the United States in 1898, it was annexed as an incorporated territory rather than an unincorporated territory. And so unincorporated territory, that was kind of a new designation for the territories acquired from Spain in the Spanish-American War. And those were, the term unincorporated, one of the things that meant was that those territories were not officially eligible for statehood, whereas Hawaii was eligible for statehood. And the reason given was because of kind of white rule in Hawaii, right? The power of white elites in Hawaii, right, were seen, and because it was a settler society. So even though they were in the minority. So that does in some ways set the stage for statehood. But it is, you know, as you say, it's truly remarkable when you think about kind of the virulence of anti-Asian racism, you know, and the kind of the ways in which that, you know, certainly isn't completely overturned after World War II, but to contrast statehood, to contrast even, you know, especially you have this this 100th Infantry Battalion, you know, that's made up of Japanese Americans from Hawaii who end up becoming like one of the most decorated, or if I think the most decorated military units in US history. There's a whole film made about them. They're, you know, they're really celebrated in American culture, right? You know, and this is, you know, only a few years, you know, this is, you know, at the same time that Japanese Americans were being interned, right? So, you know, I think it is the swiftness of that transformation is really significant. And I think, yeah, you're right. It takes place within the context of the broader civil rights movement. I think, you know, first of all, scholars have now started talking about, you know, immigration reform as part of civil rights. Hawaii statehood usually doesn't get talked about as part of civil rights, but I, you know, and I think it fits sort of awkwardly in there. But, you know, it's certainly, you know, for instance, I mean, like, if you follow kind of the politics of it, right, it does take Lyndon Johnson in the Senate kind of pushing moderate Democrats toward a civil rights agenda, of which Hawaii statehood is kind of one of those, right? So it is, you know, within kind of the political sphere, they are kind of seen as related. You know, that being said, like, you know, I think one of the things that happens is that, like, you know, and other people have written about this, Ellen Wu, for instance, right, you know, kind of the model minority discourse that comes out of Hawaii statehood, that's not only part of Hawaii statehood, you know, in many ways kind of undermines, you know, African-American civil rights, right? Because Asians are held up as somehow being able to like overcome racism or whatever in a way that African-Americans are not. And you see that in some of the discussions around Hawaii as well.
One thing that struck me about Gateway State is it supplies a really deep context for Barack Obama in a few different ways, right? I mean, so you describe how Hawaii becomes a sort of place where international diplomacy can happen because it is ostensibly free of the kind of, at least the kind of Jim Crow racism that is still, you know, dominant in the U.S. mainland. And so it becomes a kind of place to stage international centers so that the U.S. can be shown off without having to sort of then explain away, you know, the obvious and uncomfortable features of its racial regime. But you kind of set the whole thing up, right? So you explain that the reason that the Barack Obama's white grandparents and then mother were there in the first place was because they were very interested in Hawaii as a racial utopia. They wanted to go, like that was the pitch, or at least that was the pull in Hawaii. And then of course, the Obama's mother meets his father in, you know, it's like a Russian language class as part of an international student exchange that's brought him there, or scholar exchange that's brought him there. So you really get a sense reading your book. You're like, oh, this is how this very person with a very interesting background and trajectory, it makes perfect sense now that he would come out of Hawaii, and it would be hard to imagine someone with that background coming out of some other US state.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things is, yes, of course, a lot of this is about sort of the construction of Hawaii's image as a multiracial paradise, right? But it does have a somewhat different racial regime than the rest of the United States, right? It is majority non-white, you know, which is not to say there's no racism in Hawaii at all, you know, but it also, and it does become a place where, you know, I mean, you know, with the East-West Center, it really, you know, focuses more on people from Asia coming to Hawaii, but it does become this kind of center for global exchange in all these ways, right? It does, people are actually brought from Hawaii and the continental US, right? And kind of meet in the middle, which was sort of the intention. Now that doesn't always go as planned, but it does become a space for those exchanges.
So let's talk about the "it doesn't always go as planned" part, because in your book you're very careful to highlight the significance of Hawaii's symbolic importance and how it's presented and how it's pitched, and this is different from other U.S. states, and it has a sort of particular function with U.S. diplomacy. But you're also clear that the image doesn't map onto the reality, and I think one of the areas where people have, or at least scholars have been the most critical of statehood and its achievement, particularly as a sort of achievement for racial justice, has to do with when you look at Hawaii statehood from an indigenous perspective. So from the perspective not of Asian Americans who were previously ineligible to be citizens and now are, sending forth senators and members of the House of Representatives, but from natives of sort of people who are indigenous to the Hawaiian Islands, who have very little place in the sort of high politics of Hawaii by that time. And there was a book that came out right around the same time your book came out by Dean Saranilio at NYU, basically portraying statehood as kind of doubled down colonialism, right? It's one thing to be a colony, at least you could be independent. Once you're a state though, it's completely locked in. And in fact, this is the colony being sort of more firmly or more fully colonized. Can you sort of put your narrative in conversation with that, or tell us how you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's certainly, you could absolutely, of course, say the same thing about statehood, the rest of the continental US, right? That's part of settler colonialism, right? That statehood is, one form of colonialism. At the same time, statehood occurs within the context of decolonization, right? It is, according to kind of these UN standards, right, like one form of self-government, right? So decolonization, according to the UN, right, does not have to result in independence. It generally does, but in some cases, and certainly, with some of like the French départements, right, you see similar kinds of sort of changes in status, so it's tricky. I don't, I'm not going to come down. It's hard for me to say, is it decolonization? It's certainly, if it is, it's an uneven form of decolonization. And I think, for many Asian Americans in Hawaii, it does represent a form of decolonization, especially when it comes in the context of changes to, immigration and naturalization laws. But, and those part of the problem with my research was like, a lot of my sources really didn't talk about Native Hawaiians, except in the most sort of superficial gloss, right? And then they moved on, right? Again, sort of the emphasis in these discussions about Hawaii was on Hawaii's Asian population, even in a lot of the tourism materials. So that certainly posed a challenge for me in terms of how to talk about these things. And I guess, part of what happens is, you see the ways in the kind of perniciousness of this model minority discourse and kind of liberal multiculturalism. It doesn't really have a place for Native Hawaiians or indigenous people, right? It doesn't tell a happy, because if you talk about Native Hawaiians, right, that doesn't tell a kind of triumphalist story. And then you see these tensions really play out in the ethnic studies movement where, there's a critique among Native Hawaiians about kind of, Asian Americans in Hawaii, where, that they've managed to achieve this level of power through statehood that Native Hawaiians have not, right? And then that leads to kind of a Native Hawaiian studies program that's separate from ethnic studies, and that's very much aligned with the sovereignty movement, which, in a lot of the scholarship that's produced is, really focuses on Hawaii as part of Oceania and, its links to other Pacific islands, as part of a kind of project to separate Hawaii's history from the United States and from Asia. But of course it's tricky because, Hawaii's modern history is very much tied up in, both US settler colonialism and US imperialism in Asia.
Can we hear a little more about that? Because I thought one of the things that your book does that surprised me is, right at the end, we get a sort of very rich and textured dive into intellectual history, where we get all of these issues not just being sort of, deduced from, your readings of various State Department papers, but being argued out in the campus hallways at the University of Hawaii. And you talk about the sort of conflicts and sometimes get into the sort of embodied versions of them as, various programs are funded and defunded, between multiculturalism as a frame, ethnic studies as a frame, and the various sort of, and the numerous variants of those. Could you say a little more about that, or just give us a sense of what the issues are as you see them?
So first of all, I think ethnic studies in Hawaii is very much occurs, emerges within the context of Black and ethnic studies elsewhere in the United States. At the same time, in the discussions, at the University of Hawaii about what ethnic studies should look like, there is a real emphasis on, Hawaii's distinctiveness, right? And a need to again, really kind of, sever the links in some ways between Hawaii and the rest of the United States, right? That yes, it's both a kind of, in the somewhat contradictory way, right? That the problems, Hawaii is not a racial paradise. It suffers many of the same problems as the rest of the United States. At the same time, it's a unique place that, so like a lot of these ethnic studies courses very specifically say, we're only going to be talking about Hawaii, right? That's the only relevant frame here, which I guess, again, sort of speaks to your question about kind of place and space. And, so I think at that time, and still to some extent today, right, there is this idea that, Hawaii's history is sort of enclosed in this way, or should be, as part of a kind, that for advancing particular kind of political aims, should be talked about, in a kind of more local frame.
Yeah. You described statehood as a form of decolonization, which makes a lot of sense to me because I know that it happened within the sort of global context of a decolonization movement and was seen by the United States as a way to, just in a very formal sense, to remove Hawaii from its list of non-self-governing territories, which it had to issue reports on and send to the UN, to its enormous embarrassments as Moscow took joy in sort of poking the United States on that issue. But, we know a lot about decolonization in its canonical form, which is independence. And you and I are both alums of that decolonization seminar, which was so helpful. And, we know that decolonization, political independence doesn't give you everything. There are ongoing issues and limits to the sort of form of, political independence as a new nation state obviously takes. And that's a discussion that, at least to my ears, sounds pretty familiar. Decolonization as statehood is less familiar, right? There's fewer examples of it. They tend to be located in the United States. But could you talk a little bit about what are the limits of that kind of decolonization? I get the ostensible benefits, which is just sort of full inclusion with all the rights as other citizens, but are there ways in which you see it as a kind of limited form of decolonization, or as one that has perils that you came across?
I guess, the big one, right, is that it erases colonialism, right? So, and that, that's what's so interesting about a lot of the discussions around statehood, is that the proponents of statehood are not referring to it as decolonization. They're referring to it as self-government, right? But of course, they're talking about the need for statehood and self-government in the context of global decolonization. But to call it decolonization would be to acknowledge that it's a colony and to acknowledge American colonialism, right? So I think, it does really significant historical work, right, in erasing colonialism, which I think is also part of the project of like erasing Native Hawaiians. So I guess that I would say that's sort of the big one, right? Whereas with independence, there's of course, and this would vary across nations, right? But there's certainly an attempt to move past colonialism, right? But I don't think it erases colonialism in the same way.
Yeah, this comes up often when I'm teaching U.S. foreign relations. If you look at a normal map of the United States. You just see sort of wall-to-wall carpeting of states. And so it's very easy to think, okay, this is a republic, everything in here is a state, there's sort of voting processes within it. And it becomes hard to talk about decolonization in the context of settler colonialism, right? Because the injury or the form of colonialism is dispossession. So the land has been taken and then replaced with self-governing states that sort of hook up into, you know, some larger self-governing federal structure. So the political structure could be a Republican one, and yet the process that generated it could have been an imperial one, right? That one just works by displacing and then sort of, you know, putting in some kind of quasi-Republican form in its stead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, right, I mean, you know, so that in the sense that Hawaii is, you know, Hawaii is unique in a lot of ways, right? But it also is very much, I think, a process of that, of settler colonialism, you know, during the 19th century, right? You know, there's, because you have white settlers moving to Hawaii, you know, who see it at, you know, who talk about it in many of the same terms as people who talk, you know, settlers moving out west, right? You know, in North America. So, so yeah, you know, I think it's, which is one of, you know, as your book makes clear, right? Americans have a hard time admitting that the US has like a formal overseas empire, right? But it's like, also has a very hard time admitting that it has an empire within North America, right? Or that it's the product of settler colonialism within North America. Yeah.
I have one more question and then we will turn it over to the audience. But before we do, just procedurally, Eric, I would like to ask you a question. How do you want audience members to indicate that they have a question?
You beat me to it. I'm going to let them know. There's a Q&A function on Zoom. They can post their question there. There's the raise hand function that will allow them to speak once we call on them and unmute them. And if they are watching on Facebook Live and can do neither of those things, they can email a question to Rachel Wheatley, whose information are Wheatley at historians.org is in the chat function as well.
Okay, great. I see the questions piling up, so I'll just ask one more and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Sarah, in writing this book, in researching it, what surprised you the most?
I mean, I guess the big one that surprised me is what ended up kind of being one of my main arguments, which was that, you know, I'd gone in expecting that this was going to be a story about like Americanization and assimilation and, you know, what that tells us about midnight. I don't even know. I mean, if I were to go back and read my dissertation proposal, I would be, I think, quite shocked at what I thought I would find out. But, you know, reading the sources and, you know, as this picture came into view, you know, it was really quite surprising to see that, you know, really the kind of main arguments for statehood, at least by the time it became a state in 1959, were about, you know, Hawaii's difference, right? And its Asianness and its foreignness. And that's, you know, that didn't really comport with, you know, I think this idea of the 1950s as being, you know, a continuation at least of kind of older assimilationist discourses, you know, and I think, you know, and that again, you know, it's like you only see a kind of pushback with, you know, kind of in the late 1960s and 1970s among both white ethnics, you know, but also people of color, you know, insisting on, you know, the need for cultural recognition. So I would say that was the biggest surprise. And then that kind of ended up driving a lot of the rest of the project. So I don't know if there are any grad students in the audience, but, you know, it just come to your sources with an open mind, I guess would be the lesson from that.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
It sounds like we have a lot of questions now.
Good. I should say as we go forward, if you want to weigh in, Daniel, at any point, let's make this a discussion. Great. I'm glad we're all on the same page. Just a note, those of you in the Q&A, I can read your questions, but maybe you want to deliver them yourself. If so, just switch over to the raise hand function and read that question when we call on you. But it's your choice, of course. The first person in our queue is someone familiar to the Washington History Seminar. We have Dane Kennedy. So if Dane unmutes himself. You may pose your question.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, first of all, Sarah, lovely to see you, even if only virtually. It's a wonderful book, and also the conversation between you and Daniel was terrific and actually raised a lot of the issues I intended to raise. So let me just put the central one in the starkest and most simple terms. I mean, you, I think, quite convincingly demonstrate that the story of Hawaii's progression to statehood is really a story that needs to be seen in the context of decolonization. You refer to Hawaii quite rightly before independence or before its statehood as a colony. And yet, of course, the outcome is quite different from what happens in all European empires, really, for that matter. That is incorporation within the American state. And so the basic question I have for you is really, why does Hawaii take this different trajectory? Is it because the United States itself is very different from European empires at this time? Or is it because Hawaii is very different? I'm thinking, for example, about sort of comparing Hawaii to Puerto Rico, which goes on a somewhat different trajectory. I'm just curious if you could sort of talk more comparatively about the American empire, the story of Hawaii in that empire, and the way in which it takes a different trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of those things in some ways that you mentioned. I mean, you know, for one thing, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of Daniel's book, is, you know, that the ways in which US empire is obscured, right? You know, and in many ways, right from the kind of, you know, and specifically kind of overseas territorial empire is obscured right from the very beginning. You know, there's a lot of excitement over the Spanish-American War at the beginning, and that very quickly fades. And, you know, one reason, for instance, is, and I do think this, without making an argument for American exceptionalism, I do think this is different. The United States is different from Europe in this regard. You know, there is a pretty vocal anti-imperialist movement in the United States. That's, you know, and you have a kind of coalition of people who, you know, are kind of morally outraged by empire, and then a bunch of racists who don't want, you know, non-white colonial subjects to be part of the United States. And that, for instance, leads to Philippine independence, right? You know, so you have the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934, I think 1934, right, which outlines a path for Philippine independence. You know, and so I think American national identity, as fraught an idea as that is, I think really is bound up in this idea that the United States is not an empire, is not an imperial power. And so I think that's part of it. So again, statehood serves as a kind of a way to like elide America's colonial history. And at the same time, I think, you know, if you think of some of the differences between, say, Hawaii and Puerto Rico, right? You know, at the same time, in this moment of global decolonization, you have the Cold War, right? You know, there's been scholarship around this, right, where it's like decolonization is sort of already up and running, right, even before World War II, and then the Cold War kind of, you know, the Cold War is a contingency that then has, you know, all kinds of impacts on the course of decolonization, right? And you know, in some cases that means that the United States actually seeks to undermine decolonization, right, of certain, you know, French or British territories. You know, so the United States has a very spotty record when it comes to, you know, its kind of practical commitment to decolonization, right? You know, and that's often informed by, right, Cold War strategy. And so Hawaii sort of fits in there in this awkward way because, you know, again, I think it was important for the United States, you know, to grant Philippine independence, and that was already, you know, sort of planned for before World War II. But, you know, so it's both important in a domestic sense, right? You know, for Hawaii to become a state, you know, because it kind of helps tell this anti-colonial narrative to the United States, but also because of Hawaii's, again, sort of strategic importance to US foreign policy in Asia, which is not, there's not really an equivalent in Puerto Rico, right? Latin America at this point is not as strategically important to the United States in the Cold War. So I think statehood is a kind of product of all of those different factors coming together.
Thank you. I'm going to call on David Sobelson, if you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself before you begin to speak.
Hi, I'm a scholar in Washington, D.C. who is interested in history and also in political science. And what I'd like to know is the two speakers' views about the effect of Hawaii's multiculturalism on the birther attacks on President Obama, whether the multiculturalism of Hawaii actually gave any ammunition to those attacks.
I mean, my instinct would be to say yes, without really getting into like the mind space of the birthers. I think, certainly there's this sense that, Hawaii, I think part of what was going on, perhaps implicitly was this idea that Hawaii wasn't somehow like fully part of the United States, and maybe it didn't have the same kind of record keeping. I think that was one implication of some of the birthers, right? That it was like Hawaii had poor record keeping compared to the rest of the US, which was why, they could have this forged birth certificate or whatever. And with Jeff Sessions talking about, the Hawaii Circuit Court rejecting, I think, was it the Muslim ban, right? And it was like, why should this island in the Pacific be designating US policy, right? I do think that, yes, that this kind of, this sort of celebration of Hawaii's difference that we see in the post-World War II period, right? This emphasis on Hawaii's difference then, makes it easier to make those kinds of claims. But I don't know, Daniel, you might have thought about this more than I have.
I'm obsessed with the topic. I'd like to just affirm what you said, but add some other things to it that point in the same direction. Yeah, I mean, my sense is that, Sarah described Hawaii's statehood as incomplete, which is, legally you're either a state or not. But I think that gets at a real truth at the place of Hawaii within mainland self-conception of what the United States is. You can still see maps of the United States, not like official ones, but less official ones that don't have Hawaii or Alaska on them. And it's pretty clear to me, at least, that's right about Obama, that the first thing that happens is that there's an evolution of the birther myth. So when Obama's running against Hillary Clinton, her people, so they're hoping that he will be ineligible for the presidency, so he will lose the primary. They're not worried about the general at this point. Some people on her team point out that the fact that he's born in Polynesia seems like it makes him kind of squishy in some way. And so they suggest to her that she should begin every speech saying, "I was born in the middle of America," implicitly because Obama couldn't say that. So when he defeats her in the primary, it's her supporters who start circulating rumors of a different kind, that he's not born in the United States, but in the sense of being born in Kenya. And then those hop the lines and take on a new life with the Republicans and become Trump's entree into presidential politics. I mean, that's the issue that puts the spotlight on him. And, we've had a lot of major Black politicians, and that particular libel, "This person is not born in the United States," that's unusual. And I think a lot of that has to do with people's, or mainlanders, sort of instinctive sense that even if Hawaii is a state, there's something kind of inchoately foreign about it. There's a kind of stink of the foreign that sort of remains on it somehow. And I think that encouraged a lot of people to look at Obama and to see not just someone who was Black and then, at whom they might throw all the kind of anti-Black racist stereotypes, but also someone who was foreign in some way. And I think that had a lot to do with why that particular lie stuck.
Bill Hatch has his hand up. If you would unmute and introduce yourself. The mute thing went off and then it went back on again. So let's take it off again.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Yes, hello, Sarah. I am the great-grandson of Francis March Hatch, whom I presume you've come across in your research. He was the vice president of the provincial government and later the Republic of Hawaii. He led the Republic of Hawaii's delegation to the US to negotiate the annexation treaty. So my simple question actually is, do you think America was historically and strategically justified in annexing Hawaii in, I think it was 1898, especially in light of the strategic role of Japan at that time?
Oh, can you just clarify what strategic role of Japan you're referring to?
Well, of course, there were a lot of Japanese on the island at that time, and my sense is that if we didn't annex Hawaii at that time, Japan certainly would have made a strong move to take over the islands, and that would have certainly changed the whole outlook of World War II.
I mean, perhaps, I think, I guess my sympathies lie with, the fact that Hawaii, was an independent republic, of course, right? And that settlers in Hawaii overthrew the Hawaiian queen, right? And then instituted this government that, then excluded most people living in Hawaii, right? Which then kind of allowed for annexation. And, it's really, really difficult to separate the annexation of Hawaii from the Spanish-American War. Wasn't part of the Spanish-American War, but it happened annexation happened in the middle of the Spanish-American War. So I see it very much in the context of kind of, American high imperialism of 1898.
We have Mo LaBelle with a hand up, if you would unmute.
Hi, Mo.
Hi, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Daniel. I always love listening to the two of you. You two are so smart and so awesome. And so thanks for taking time to do this kind of stuff. And I look forward to us crossing paths. Sorry, my name is Maurice LaBelle. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. I've also had the pleasure of sharing space, particularly at Schaefer, with both Sarah and Daniel. So my question for Sarah and Daniel is, I was listening to you, Sarah, talk about kind of the United States trying to be anti-colonial in the case of Hawaii and where this fits into kind of an international and global context, right? Of what you call global decolonization. I also can't help but think that there's also, the United States is also trying to be non-imperial. And so my question is how do you wrap your head around this kind of teetering between being anti-colonial on the one hand and non-imperial on the other? And what I mean by non-imperial is in this light that both of you have been talking about, the work primarily, of course, that Daniel's been doing, right? In terms of making things not visible.
So sorry. Okay, so just ask the question again.
The question is on the tension between anti-colonial, kind of like an anti-colonial position in Hawaii, and a non-imperial one. So by anti-colonial, I would just mean, of course, just to clarify, being against empire, whereas non-imperial is more directly just about denying empire.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think Hawaii helps us helps us to understand how central denial of empire is to American foreign policy during the Cold War. I think there's certainly all kinds of continuities between sort of US interventionism and colonialism, European colonialism in much of the decolonizing world. But the belief and the assertion that the United States is, an anti-colonial global power, right, that itself does not have any imperial or colonial ambitions, does, I think, shape US policy, right? It does mean, right, that ultimately we're only intervening, say, in Vietnam, right, with the goal of promoting an independent democratic nation state, right? It's a temporary stopgap for that. We're not going to occupy this country, right? We're doing, so again, that's often kind of the justification for what can only be called kind of imperial interventions, right? At the same time, right, you do see, there is, this real emphasis in so much of Cold War policy, that I explore in a bit more depth in the book, right, on kind of the cultural competency of, American foreign policy agents or actors, right? That's a big emphasis, within the Peace Corps, for instance, right, and kind of demonstrating America's respect for non-Western cultures, right, and kind of and sort of performing kind of celebration of different cultures, right? And I think, in a way, that is different in many ways, right, from the kind of European colonial approach. At the same time, right, that there are of course limits on the level of difference that the United States is willing to accept, right? It's not willing to accept vastly different approaches to like political economy, for instance. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I see those things as working in a weird way, both in conflict, but in sort of productive ways also for US foreign policy in this period.
Mo, you've differentiated sort of two ways of responding to empire. One is to say, I'm against it and, we should seek to decolonize. And the other is to say, what empire, what us chicken, like, what are you talking about? And I think that the United States has to deal with, at post-1945, has to deal with the fact that it quite obviously has territories, even if it doesn't like to talk about them. And one way to deal with that is how it deals with the Philippines, which is to grant the Philippines freedom and then to sort of go on at great length about, the great benefit of the United States as an imperialist is that its heart was never in it, and it was just always preparing the Philippines for freedom anyway, and he hardly even liked it in the first place. But Hawaii and Alaska give you a very different narrative, right? And they give you the narrative, Mo, that you're pointing to, which is that these places weren't even colonies, right? And the United States doesn't like to use the C word, it talks in terms of territories instead. And the way that these places weren't really colonies is that they become states, just like Kansas did. And so the statehood becomes part of, I think, Mo, what you can correctly call a non-imperial narrative, right? This isn't that the United States was an empire and then decolonized like Britain, but that it was never an empire, and statehood shows you that.
Thank you. I was going through the questions in the Q&A and was just about to read the question from Travis Seifman, but coincidentally, his hand is up. So I'm going to ask Travis to unmute and pose your question yourself.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, my name is Travis Seifman. I'm a postdoc at the University of Tokyo and an alumnus of University of Hawaii and East-West Center. So thanks so much for this fantastic conversation. I was just curious, the whole conversation about what Washington or how the mainland is looking at Hawaii in terms of race, right? In terms of unfit for being American, or however you want to say that. That's all fascinating. And I'm curious, what was the role of local Japanese, local Chinese, other people in Hawaii in seeking statehood or opposing statehood? And how does that compare or relate to, this mainland discourse on Hawaii's sort of not white enough Asian character?
Yeah, I think, so I touched on this briefly in my talk, right? But in 1954, you have, real transformation in local Hawaii politics, right? Where you have this coalition of, Nisei, right? Second generation Japanese Americans, partly, they gain, they're born right in the United States, so they are citizens in a way that their parents are not, right? So the kind of Asian population within Hawaii sort of ages into citizenship in the starting earlier, right? But really kind of coming to fruition in many ways in the post-war period. And, you know, they're generally very in favor of statehood. And so I do think that makes a difference on the ground in terms of how the Statehood Commission, for instance, works with, you know, mainland members of Congress, right, to promote this image of Hawaii as a multiracial paradise, right? So, so yeah, I think a lot of the Asian Americans in Hawaii are themselves central to kind of constructing that narrative in the 1950s.
Evan Dawley has a hand up. Please unmute and introduce. Go ahead. Evan Dawley, it indicates here that you are unmuted.
I'm sorry, I forgot to hit allow. That would allow the microphone to work. I apologize.
Always a good idea.
Yeah. Too many things to worry about. So I'm an associate professor at Goucher College, and I focus mostly on China and Japan in the 19th and 20th centuries and their respective colonizations of Taiwan, which is somewhat the background to my comment. And I will admit that I have a comment, not a question, so of course you're not obligated to address it at all. But my comment was inspired by sort of listening to the really interesting presentation, and then some of the comments and questions about Hawaii and its transformation from colony to state, and how that was different than the European model of empire. But it struck me as sort of very similar actually to the Japanese and Chinese models of empire, both of which involved expanding into new territories and then incorporating them as provinces. For Japan, Hokkaido and Okinawa; for China, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, all of these places became provinces, not states. And so it occurs to me that maybe there are useful comparisons to be made between the United States experience and Chinese and Japanese experiences, rather than to use Europe as the comparison. And that's really all that I had to say. So thank you for entertaining my comment and for the presentation as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, if I'm remembering my Charles Mayer correctly, right? I mean, for most of human history, you know, empire has been, you know, essentially some form of settler colonialism, right? So the idea of, you know, empire as possessing overseas colonies, right, that are very distinct from the metropole and that take a long time to get to, you know, is very much a modern phenomenon.
We have a question in the Q&A from Stephen Shore, who writes, I recall that there was a controversy about Harry Bridges, whose longshoremen's union was considered by statehood opponents as communist dominated and therefore a theoretical obstacle to Hawaiian statehood. I would just add, in your book, you do touch upon this. I think there's a New York Times editorial specifically that you cite. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about where left politics fit into the opponents of statehood's thinking. And I'm wondering if you could actually play that a little bit farther in time. You note in the book that left labor forces are influential in helping to kind of create a political revolution or transformation that bring the Democrats into power more forcefully in Hawaii. What happens to them? You write, you know, quite eloquently and powerfully about the economy of Hawaii, about the rise of the tourist industry, and then with the 1960s and 70s and 80s, with the rise of ethnic studies. But I'm wondering if there is a left in the years between that offers a critique of the economy that is being constructed in Hawaii before and after statehood. So Stephen Shore's point about thinking of anti-communists and where the left plays a role going forward.
Sure. I guess I'll just say, you know, the left in terms of its position on statehood, I'm not sure I totally grasp like the nuances of what that would look like. I think they're largely in favor of statehood, but you know, in general, the arguments around the arguments around kind of communist infiltration of Hawaii, right? And that's why it's a reason it should not become a state. In many ways, I think, again, are really hard to separate from the racism against Hawaii and people living in Hawaii, right? Because there's a sense, in some of the ways that the opponents talk about it, that first of all, again, it's like they're going to be a site for kind of mass immigration of like Chinese communist hordes. And also this idea that people in Hawaii, they're non-white, they're particularly susceptible to, communist ideology, right? Which is an argument that's used by the United States during the Cold War to talk about people in, say, Vietnam. In terms of the left critique of Hawaii's political economy, I mean, that's certainly like within the sovereignty movement, but even before the sovereignty movement, it centers on a critique of tourism. And because tourism is the #1 industry, it's essentially, went from being a kind of agricultural economy to a tourism-based economy, and that's, for perhaps somewhat obvious reasons, really problematic, right? If there's any, tourism is very susceptible to economic downturns in a way that other industries are not. It also gobbles up a lot of land. And land rights in Hawaii are an extremely fraught issue because of American colonialism and this kind of transfer of crown lands of, the monarchy's lands to the, territorial government, and all sorts of shenanigans in which, Native Hawaiians were supposed to have, we're supposed to get homesteads and never did. And in the meantime, the Democratic Party in Hawaii has, essentially like sold those lands to the tourism industry, and again, the Hawaii in terms of land mass is not that big. So these issues are really, really fraught. It also, tourism also means that local residents don't always have access to beaches. So yeah, there's a very vocal critique of the tourism industry. At the same time, a sense that it's a kind of very difficult trap to get out of, because Hawaii's economy is so reliant on tourism. So people within Hawaii are very, from the time period I looked at, when you see these polls, are very ambivalent on tourism, right? On the one hand, there's the sense of we need it, we need tourists. On the other hand, we don't like what it's doing to Hawaii society, and we wish there were other industries providing jobs.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Brian Sullum. If you would unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Go ahead.
I'm unmuted.
Yes.
I'm a former resident of Hawaii. I was a 10-year-old when statehood was granted. And I remember about 90% of the population approved of statehood. It was something that was welcomed by the islands because we were really, DC's motto is America's colony. Well, in Hawaii, we paid taxes and had no right to vote for national office. So I remember that was a big deal. But I do want to say that from my perspective, the things that were driving statehood on the ground were economic. The sugar industry was being whipsawed because every couple of years the Sugar Act came up, and the allocation of sugar being imported into the US affected Hawaii greatly. And as I remember it, of course, I was a 10-year-old, and I will confess that I wasn't that observant at that age, that sugar was the kind of the driving force. And at the time, tourism was a distant third, or even fourth. The things that were driving the Hawaiian economy then were first sugar, second pineapple, and lastly the military, and then tourism. But anyway, and one other thing, you mentioned that access to the beaches is restricted. Actually, Hawaii, all beaches are public except for those around military installations. You have to provide access to beaches. It's almost like a civil right.
Well, yeah, just I think that they're harder to get to with all the hotels. But yes, I would say in terms of sugar, yeah, you know, that's certainly for like Hawaii's white population, that's what really changes their mind around statehood in the 1930s, though, right? You know, with the passage of the Sugar Act and the limits on sugar exports from Hawaii to the mainland, right? That's what changes their mind. And that's when the original Statehood Commission is formed, you know, saying, you know, we need a vote in Congress, right? We need to be able to vote for president, right, in order to overcome, you know, and better lobby for Hawaii sugar exports. In terms of, you know, the 1950s, you know, certainly by the 1960s, tourism is the main industry in Hawaii, and it outpaces all federal spending in Hawaii. Now, in the 1950s, right, it's not until 1959 that you have jet service to Hawaii from the rest of the United States. So, and that really, and statehood, along with statehood, that really transforms Hawaii's economy. But you do, you know, sugar tourism is, and again, the military, as you point out, is starting to outpace the kind of more traditional agricultural economy already in the 50s.
Thank you. John Lawrence has a question in the Q&A. He asks, the importance of Hawaii, of the US military's presence, to Hawaii, of the US military's presence, and the correlative importance of Hawaii to the US military presumably played a role in the ultimate statehood decision. Have you given any thought to the somewhat comparable situation in Cuba, where the US chose to grant independence while retaining a perpetual grant of the Guantanamo naval base?
Yeah, I mean, I think your example of Cuba sort of helps us understand this. The military, you know, from the sources I looked at, they didn't care as long as they could continue to have access to their bases, you know, whether Hawaii became a state or not. So in general, you know, and Dwight Eisenhower, right, obviously in general, he was very much in support of Hawaii statehood. For reasons of U.S. foreign policy. So, you know, the military, you know, a lot of military leaders could see the benefits, again, in this more kind of sort of image, the image of the United States as projected through Hawaii statehood. But from a strategic point of view, statehood didn't really change the military's position in Hawaii, right? And that's what, so they, you know, that was obviously, that was their concern around statehood. Are we going to still have access to our bases? And the answer was yes. So it didn't really, you know, affect their thinking on statehood all that much.
We have time for one last question. This one from the Q&A from Allison Russell, who asks, you mentioned the anti-colonial and multicultural forces having some influence on Hawaii's statehood. Could you compare that with the political and social statehood movements in Puerto Rico and why Puerto Rico was not treated similarly? Is this exclusively the type of diversity, Asian American versus Latinx, or are there other reasons?
I think that it's a very complicated answer from the perspective of, you know, like the US foreign policy establishment and Congress. You know, yes, I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, there are Asians in Hawaii, and the United States is very invested in expanding its role in Asia in the 1950s and 1960s, whereas that's not really the case in Latin America at that time. You know, but there's also the fact that Hawaii and Puerto Rico are very different demographically, right? Puerto Rico isn't a white settler community, and Puerto Ricans themselves are very divided over, you know, you know, to this day are very divided over whether they want to remain a commonwealth, become a state, or achieve independence from the rest of the United States. And, you know, that was true at the time as well, right? Whereas in Hawaii, you do have some Native Hawaiians at the time who are in favor of independence, but at that time, not really an organized sovereignty movement. And but the in Hawaii, again, in the 50s, the kind of largest opponents are white people in Hawaii, right, who don't want to give up their power, right, and see statehood as something that would force them to do that. So yeah, so they're quite different from both kind of a bottom-up perspective and from the perspective of from the U.S. government. And also, again, Puerto Rico is not officially an incorporated territory, going back again to kind of 1898.
Unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close. I think we could go on for some time, but it is now 5:30. I want to thank Daniel and Sarah for participating in this webinar, and thanks to all of you who asked questions, and apologies to those who didn't get a chance to pose them. With that, I turn the screen back to Christian Osterman. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. Just a reminder to everyone that we will meet again next week on Monday, February 8th, when we'll discuss Tyler Stovall's new book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea. Thanks to Sarah, to Daniel, Eric, for a really terrific, I would say, riveting conversation. Thanks to our audience out there for watching and participating. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night. Thanks, everyone.